Good afternoon, everybody. Really a pleasure to be here today talking about my favourite subject, which is, of course, mountains. Here we can see here. What have mountains got to do with everybody's lives? For me, they're a huge chunk of my life, and I will be talking about a personal experience and my journey, but I really do hope that it has some relevance to your lives as well, and some comment about us as people. I'll talk about, yes, the physical mountain, but how we as people respond on it, our behaviour, and most importantly, if I may, I'm going to be looking at decision-making and the rational and emotional inputs into how we make decisions. Now, the mountains generally, reflecting on it through my life, have been really the biggest gift that I could possibly have had in a number of ways. I mean, first, I think people relate to the fact that they're huge, they're magnificent to look at, they're sort of constant and an ever-changing world, and they offer solace and I think also for me a lot of fun. I'm sure there are a lot of people here who climb and ski. I enjoy that as well, and just walking in the mountains sort of gives me a sense of well-being, which I love and draws me back again and again. But it is really the learning from the mountains that I want to focus on today, and as I say, specifically around that subject of decision-making. When I think about decision-making, I think, the rational aspect of it that I think many of us are trained to do in schools, particularly through our education system, sort of facts and figures and statistics and experiments and control experiments and what have you, to think logically. And many of us might think that that logical, rational input is a major part in making decisions. But what I want to talk about today is actually the other side, namely the emotional input into decision-making, which we might think we have at bay and in control, but actually has a far bigger impact in our decision-making than we might think. Now, sometimes that's very positive. I believe emotion is a very strong driver, but sometimes it can lead to our downfall, and I just want to illustrate that in the mountains and how that might be. So, if I were to look at my story, I'm going to keep, by necessity, a lot of it very brief because it extended over several years and I have less than 20 minutes. So the initial bit of how I came to climbing mountains, I will just tell you that as a journalist, I was invited to Everest to report on an Anglo-American expedition. I thought everybody at that point was completely barking mad to risk their lives to climb a big lump of rock. But in a sort of natural inquisitiveness and a need also to write articles to send home to the newspaper, I started asking questions and climbed a little bit myself to find out what it was about. And in that very experience, I got rather hooked. And I decided that actually climbing mountains was really what it was all about and that I wanted to climb Everest, where I happened to be. If I were to look at decisions along the way, of course there were a multitude of them, but I'm just going to look at 3 decision points that came between my deciding I wanted to do it and actually getting to the mountain and climbing it itself. The first was that I had a stable job working as a journalist, and when I wanted to go off to the Himalayas for a period of 3 months or so to climb, this was back in the early 90s, you won't remember, but there was a recession in the early 90s as well. And the financial director on the magazine that I was working for gave me a choice. He said, you can climb your mountain or you can keep your job. You can't do both. Now, if I was to examine that rationally at the time, giving up the security of a monthly paycheck, a mortgage to pay, coming back to what job prospects, everybody was looking for a job, this was going to be difficult. It didn't really add up and didn't make sense. What I know, is that actually I did give up my job and I did go off to Everest. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting all of you should throw in the towel, whatever you're doing, studying or for future careers, what have you. But for me, this was important. As I say, rationally, I just had to think, how am I going to do this? Okay, I can let my flat, I can sell my car, I can eat lentils, whatever it takes, not my style particularly, but whatever it takes I can do to make this work. But it was driven by emotion. It was driven by the fact I wanted to climb this mountain and nothing was going to get in my way. I couldn't not go, excuse the double negative. I had to go to this mountain, so I really had no choice in the matter. Well, getting there, and again, I'm going to be keeping the story relatively brief, but of course it wasn't just me. It was a whole team of people from this country and another team of people that we met when we got there, namely the Sherpas, who played a huge part in the success of this expedition, and their story will be interwoven with ours. Under the umbrella of this one Everest expedition, we climbed together. I'd love to talk to you more about the relationships between the people, but that was key. The relationships, the strengths, overcoming any barriers there might have been, and building up trust and respect between us was really, really crucial to this expedition. Anyhow, climbing here, things moved on pretty easily through the Khumbu icefall. I say easily, it happened. There was a certain element of fear walking over these ladders with huge voids beneath your feet. We actually had 36 ladders like this to climb. But this is very briefly through the first obstacle on the mountain. The real obstacle on the mountain, if I can get there quickly, is this top 3,000 feet or 1,000 meters of the mountain. Doesn't look dangerous. By comparison to the Khumbu icefall, which looked and felt very dangerous, it looks quite straightforward. The slopes are gentle. But I must tell you that, of course, the thing about Everest which makes it dangerous is not that you've got more steps to climb to get to the top because it's higher, but because as you go higher, of course, the air gets thinner, it gets colder, your blood gets thicker, and really you're entering what now rather dramatically is called the death zone, where the chance of survival over, let's say, a period of 24 hours are minimal. So you're going there to a place on the edge where human beings really shouldn't be, can't expect to live very long, and you just kind of, I was going to use the word run, you don't do anything very quickly up there, but you don't waste time, let's put it that way. You get up to the top and back down again as quickly as you possibly can. Now, in our journey, which took a period of weeks, by the way, establishing camps and slowly climbing up the mountain and going up and down, putting all the supplies that were needed into the camps and such like, and acclimatizing in the process. We got to the South Col here, which is the high camp, on the 8th of May 1993. May is generally the time that people climb. Now, the expectation at this point was that from this high camp, we would set out at about 11 o'clock at night, climb to the top and back down again. You might ask, why 11 o'clock at night? Well, the reason being that you've got about an 18-hour climb. There simply aren't enough hours of daylight, so some of it has to be done in the dark. So that's what we might have done. In the event, we didn't. There were lots of other expeditions around. Many of them made a decision to go that night. Indeed, one of our own climbers, a guy called Harry Taylor, decided to climb that night. The rest of us didn't, and for me that was enormously frustrating because, as I said, I thought we were going to go, other people were going, and yet our small group made a decision not to, based on facts which over time I've grown to accept were perfectly reasonable, but at the time, as I said, were incredibly annoying. But one of our numbers wasn't well, that was fair enough. Nothing we could do about that. It was also windy on the South Col, and the feeling was that the weather perhaps wasn't good enough. Well, we didn't go. As I said, Harry Taylor did. He got to the top. He got into trouble because he got snow blindness. He couldn't see on his way down. And sorry to sort of brief over a dramatic period so quickly, but he really would have lost his life had it not been for two Spanish climbers who found him floundering around in the snow and managed to drag him back to the tent where we were on the South Col. So another night passed, looking after Harry. Two of the climbers had already descended the mountain, and the following day, I descended the mountain with two Sherpas, Aung Pasang and Kami Cherry, and the leader of the expedition, John Barry, stayed with Harry yet another night before he was able to get him back down the mountain. So this was a huge drama and really does illustrate the environment that we're in. I mean, Harry was an extremely strong, extremely experienced climber, but one tiny error of not wearing his sunglasses for a period probably of no more than 5 minutes in that extreme light where there's little filtration from the sun meant that he wasn't able to see and get back down the mountain safely. Well, here he is coming down the last bit, and here we are regrouped at Camp 2 at the head of the Western Coombe at the foot of the Lhotse face, and quite a long way down from the high camp where we might expect to get to the summit. This is decision point number 2, if I may say, in my own personal story, because after 4 years of dedication to this project, I had failed to take the chance which presented itself. Now, I can tell you this it causes me some pain still to say this, but that day we might have gone and didn't go. 38 people got to the top of Everest. Now, today in the world of commercialization on the mountain, maybe that isn't so unusual. I still think it's quite a high figure even today. But in 1993, that virtually doubled the number of people who'd ever climbed Everest. It was unheard of. And we could have made it 40 or 42, but instead we stayed in our tent. That was crucifying. So now, decision number 2, can we turn that around? Well, rationally, if you were to look at it, the chances of success at this point were about 1 in 100. You know, the weather forecast was bad. I was exhausted. I spent a lot of time at 8,000 meters. I was really, really tired. Everything was pointing to us striking our tents and going back down, as were everybody around us on the mountain. In the end, we didn't. And that decision was based, I think, on 3 things. 1, coming back to the heart and the emotion. I still wanted that mountain. Secondly, there was a sort of feeling that I had to do everything that was possible, and even if the weather forecast was rubbish, even if the chances were small, I had to go back up to the South Col on the off chance that the weather forecast was wrong and we were to get another chance. And the third aspect, most important, was that I was there in the company of Ang Pasang and Kami Cherry. Had it not been that the Sherpas were there to accompany me and I was to have them around purely for courage, I couldn't have done it on my own. It wasn't as if they were pulling me on a rope or even that we were roped together at all, but just their companionship gave me the courage to give it another go. And that's what we did, going back up to Camp 4 with Ang Pasang here on the right and Kami Cherry on the left. We retraced our steps and, seriously against the odds, really believing that we were climbing into failure, we went back up just on the off chance that the weather forecasts would be wrong and give us a chance to climb at the end of the season. So here we are on the South Col, and this is really the point in the decision making that I want to focus on, because you can see that I've been driven largely by emotion all the way up here. The rational hasn't mattered too much because we've been in relative safety, but now we're approaching the death zone above the South Col, above 8,000 meters on Everest. And I find it very interesting looking at how we made this decision to go. Let me tell you, that night we might have gone, we woke up, looked down in the valley below us, and there was black cloud and there was lightning. It was not the best night to go. To add to that, there had been 5 people who had lost their lives in the last couple of weeks while we were on the mountain, all above the South Col in this death zone. Difficult perhaps to absorb all that even when you're on the mountain, but it was undoubtedly the most dangerous leg of the journey that we're about to undertake. Add to that, I had relatively little experience. The climbers that I might have come from with Britain were down the hill. I was with the Sherpas. I couldn't have wished for better company, very, very experienced. But still, rationally, if you added all that up, would you risk life and limb under those conditions when you're tired, the end of the season, the weather's really iffy? Would you make a rational decision to climb that mountain? I have to say, if I was sitting here around a table discussing with people, I would be surprised if the answer were anything but no, you wouldn't. It wouldn't be worth the risk. And yet, we did make that decision. Now, if you were to examine that, I'm just going to try and outline, not that I was thinking that in the moment, of course, but rationally looking back, why I did that. There were probably 5 or so reasons. 1, the magnetism of the summit, if I can call it that. I'd invested 4 years wanting to get up this mountain. I could look up, and it was about 12 hours climb away. This isn't the very summit that you can see, but that's the south summit, and from there you look along the summit ridge, and you've only got another hour and a half's climb. We were optimistic. Sociologists talk about something called the optimistic bias. Basically, we individually believe fate will treat us kindly. You know, other people might get into trouble. We won't. You know, if we didn't have this, we wouldn't get onto airplanes and fly around the world. We wouldn't do a lot of things because we just wouldn't take the risk. But we think fate will treat us kindly. There was a degree of ignorance, actually quite a big degree of ignorance. I'd read the books and I pored over the photographs, but I'd never been there before. I'd never experienced, didn't really know what it was like. There was a false sense of security. Now, I hinted about this earlier, but the Khumbu Icefall, lower on the mountain, which this big tumbles of ice and you're climbing up cliffs and through tunnels, that is really, really frightening. And your body alerts you to that and you feel the fear. But up here, looking at gentle slopes, you can't see the lack of oxygen. It doesn't press any alarm bells on you to be frightened. You don't feel fearful. And lastly, if I may say, of course, there was rivalry. We weren't completely alone that night on the South Col. There were 3 other climbers, 2 from Spain and 1 from France. And while we were deliberating, I looked out of the tent and I saw 3 little lights making their way slowly up the slopes above us. And I thought, if they think there's a chance, there's no way I'm going to sleep here and waste that opportunity. So all those factors drove us, the Sherpas and myself, to make a decision, and we set out that night and climbed up the southeast ridge, slowly, 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 agonizing over breath, until we got to the south summit that I showed you earlier, and along the summit ridge. This is the final bit of Everest, and it drops down just over 2 kilometres to the left into the Western Coombe, just over 3 kilometres to the right into Tibet. So this is where you test your footing very, very carefully indeed. It seemed laughable. I was smiling. I couldn't believe that at the 11th hour we were making our way along this ridge to the summit. But we did make it on the 17th of May, 1993. Now, there's an unwritten rule on Everest that if you're not there by 1 o'clock, just after midday, turn around short of the summit and make sure you get back down again. Why? Because you have to get back down by nightfall. If you don't, everything slows down. If you've used oxygen, you will have run out of oxygen, and then you're in that death zone. You know, danger of being benighted, very serious danger of not coming back down at all. So that is the unwritten rule. Make sure you turn around by 1 o'clock. Now I say that because we were lucky. We got there at 20 past 12. We were also lucky because the weather held off and we got safely back down that mountain again. But just 3 years later, there was a group of people, 2 groups actually, commercial groups, led by Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. And Rob Hall, interesting enough, was the guy who sort of wrote this rule about 1 o'clock turnaround time. And that year, those 2 expeditions climbed up to the top, and for whatever reason, we'll never know, they kept going beyond 1 o'clock, beyond 2 o'clock, beyond 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock. And they were still on the summit at 5 o'clock. Now, they weren't lucky. The weather turned, and many of them were caught out. The 2 leaders and a number of the climbers as well lost their lives that day on Everest. They were, I'm surmising, as I was, in an emotional bubble, made more poignant by the fact that there was an expedition lower on the mountain looking through a telescope saying, what are they doing? They could rationalize. They weren't in that emotional bubble. Only a few days later, a friend of mine from London, having been on the mountain at the same time as this tragedy, did the same thing. He didn't make it down the mountain. Now, I was very close to this incident in that I knew the girlfriend of the guy who died, and I was furious, absolutely furious. I didn't know I had so much fury in me that he had been irresponsible and done that. He'd climbed and not come back down because he broke that rule. And as I was venting my fury, another Everester turned to me and said, oh, come on, Bex, you would have done exactly the same thing. I wasn't tested. I got there before 1 o'clock. If I hadn't got there before 1 o'clock, what about 5 past 1, 10 past 1? Where do you draw the line? He's right. I would have done the same thing. What I'm describing is a human condition. And with just a minute more, if I may, say why this is so important. Because in the mountains and in extreme examples, you can see this played out. But I feel very, very strongly that this human condition applies to all of us. All of us in the workplace. All of us, if I may, hone in on an example, 2008 in the city. Magnetism of the summit. What's the equivalent? Temptation of enormous bonuses. You'd have to be a saint to resist them. Optimism. It's been going so well. Why shouldn't it continue? Ignorance. There were derivatives that the traders and investors themselves didn't understand. False sense of security. Well, everyone's still in the office and the bars are full. It feels all right. Rivalry. Well, of course you've got to keep up with other banks. Better still, outperform them. And yes, there were small voices of rationality, but they weren't listened to. They were even fired. Now, in the mountains, perhaps it doesn't matter if a few people go and risk all. The consequences don't ripple out so far beyond their families anyway. And actually, I do believe that we need a place where people can express themselves in this way. But in the workplace, in the city, where those effects ripple out to communities and across the world, I was in Bhutan just after the crash. And there were horsemen who might have been in work guiding tourists through the mountains who were out of work because the tourists couldn't afford to go there anymore. You know, the ripples are everywhere. Now, I'm saying, if I possibly can, we shouldn't blame, we should understand. I would be the same. I would have done the same. Many of us would have done the same. Those who wouldn't are in the minority. So whereas we don't want regulation in the mountains because it doesn't ripple out and because we need some area of expression, surely we do here in England really to save ourselves from ourselves. Thank you.